In the late Yafa Eliach's book, Hasidic Tales of the Holocaust, she tells the story of a Rosh Hashana 77 years ago in Bergen-Belsen. Actually, the story began a few days before Rosh Hashana, when Wolf Fischelberg and his 12-year-old son, Leo, were walking among the barracks, when suddenly, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something flying towards him, nearly hitting his head, but instead landing at his feet. Making sure no one was watching, Wolf bent down and picked up a rock with a small note attached. He put the note into his pocket and walked into one of the barracks. There, in a corner at a distance from others, Wolf Fischelberg read the note. It was written in Hebrew by a Dutch Jew named Chaim Borek, who had Argentinian papers, and in it, Borek explained that he had a shofar, and that if the Hasidic Jews from the Polish transports wanted to use his shofar on Rosh Hashana, Borek could smuggle it in one of the coffee cauldrons, but it would mean that they would lose out on that morning's coffee. A vote was taken among the Polish Jews at the barracks, and they agreed to give up their morning coffee ration on the first day of Rosh Hashanah. The shofar was smuggled in, no one was caught, and the shofar wasn't damaged. But how can you blow a shofar without the Germans finding out? So the following shaila was posed. Is it permitted to intentionally muffle the sound of a shofar so that the passing Nazis, Yimach Shemam, would not hear it? And the answer? I'll get back to it in a few moments. But first, I want to draw your attention to a famous phrase in the davening of Rosh Hashanah. It's from the Unesana Tokef, the words, Uveshofar gadol yitakam. He will blow the great shofar, the kol d'mamadaka yishama, and a soft, murmuring voice will be heard. If it's a great shofar, why the soft voice? And the answer is because it's referring to two different events, both of which happened at Mount Sinai. The first is the obvious one. Matan Torah, when a nation of freed slaves heard and saw the thunder and the lightning and the blast of a shofar, holech v'chazek me'od, which was the great shofar of Unesana Tokef, an awesome, powerful, and extraordinary sound. But the second sound occurred about 400 years later, when Eliyahu HaNavi escaped to Sinai expecting to find God there. First in the Ruach Gdolah v'chazak mefarek harim, in a mighty wind that would shatter mountains. But God wasn't there. Then he experienced a thunderous earthquake, but God wasn't there. And then there was an ash, a fire, but once again, God wasn't there. Rather, Eliyahu only experienced God through a kol d'mamadakam, a soft, murmuring voice. So does the Unesana Tokef refer to both the power of the great shofar and the kol, the quiet, still voice of the kol d'mamadakam? Because he wanted to teach us. He wanted to teach us that God is not just found in the spectacular, the amazing, or the extraordinary. Rather, The author of the Unasana Tokef wanted to teach us that if you want to find God, listen to the soft, murmuring voices. Find God in the regular parts of life, in those things we take for granted. Just consider a few examples. A couple gets married, and the wedding is so beautiful, so lebendig, so inspiring. That's the shofar gadol, the great shofar. But what happens the day after? The everyday of married life. Is it inspired and filled with the beauty of a Jewish home? If it is, then that's the kol d'mamadakam. Or what about our spiritual selves? For while this year's davening will be so very different, there still can be a sense of awe as we focus on what's truly important for a life of meaning and a life of health. That awe is the great shofar. But what about a random Thursday in December when it's cold outside and finding a minyan for mincha is hard to fit into your schedule? Do you make it to shul? Do we take the time on an ordinary day to connect with God? If we do, that's the kol d'mamadakam. And finally, all of us are concerned about our children or grandchildren, relatives and friends, concerned about how our next generation of Jews will turn out. Will they be connected? Will they be committed and inspired Jews? Because of that, we spend a fortune on schools and trips and every form of Jewish experience imaginable. We try to provide for them the shofar gadol. But what about the kol d'mamadakam? The ordinary connection with God, the natural moments when they can see the beauty of Judaism at home, with their parents and grandparents, in the everyday. Do we work as hard? Because as great as we are as on putting on the show, from a siyum hashas to conventions and everything in between, and as important as all of those moments are when all is said and done, they're only examples of extraordinary Judaism. But what about ordinary Judaism, the kol d'mamadakam, the place where Eliyahu Hanavi actually found God? Which brings me back to the story from 1943. Was it permitted to muffle the sound of the shofar? A heated debate developed among the rabbis. The halachic arguments are not recorded in the story, but I can imagine that a Mishnah was discussed, the one dealing with a person who blew a shofar in a pit or in a barrel, and the ruling that as long as you can hear the actual shofar sound, no matter how muffled, you fulfilled the mitzvah. Did you ever wonder why the Mishnah would discuss a case of blowing a shofar in a pit or in a barrel? Said the 13th century sage, Rabbi Menachem Meiri, the reason was because this Mishnah was written during the Roman persecutions of the 2nd century when sounding the shofar was illegal. If a Roman overheard the shofar, Jews could be put to death for that crime. And therefore, they needed to know the halacham. They needed to understand if instead of the shofar gadol, would the kol d'mamadakam suffice? And the answer was yes. As long as it's real and authentic, even a muffled sound is enough. And that's what they did in Bergen-Belsen as Wolf Fischelberg blew a soft, murmuring sound, a sound that reminded them of the power of the ordinary, of the regular. As he reported 30 years later It was a sound that brought them hope that someday they would be freed. In May 1945, Wolf and his son Leo were liberated. And ultimately, they made their way to the United States, where Wolf told his story and passed away peacefully in 1986. And while we, thank God, have never had to face the dangers of that horrific time in our history, today, during this pandemic, we too have to face the question of blowing the shofar in a very different way. Will the shofar be masked? Will the sound remain the same? But maybe a masked shofar is precisely what we need to hear this year, as God has forced us to press a reset button on lives, forced us to consider what is essential and what is not. Maybe the somewhat quieter sound of the shofar this year will remind us that we need to, one day soon, step out of this pandemic with a greater appreciation of the normal, ordinary, regular engagements with God, the kol demama dakam that was beginning to be lost. Maybe this year's shofar is our prayer that we will never forget the ordinary, and that even more than the extraordinary, the ordinary is what keeps us safer and stronger, because faith grows from simple, sometimes even muffled sounds, and a future is preserved when the regular everyday is filled with devotion to God and not reserved merely for the moments of great fanfare and commotion. May this coming new year be a year when we remember the sacrifices of the past and of the present, the possibilities of the future, and the eternal truths of Jewish life. And may your family and ours find meaning and purpose in the everyday and in every moment. Shana Tova.